I want to give recognition to Delaware Riverkeeper Network for hosting this event, along with, as I said, the Sierra Club and Penn Environment, and for their advocacy on behalf of the legislation I introduced, Senate Bill 560. Riparian buffer legislation requires a minimum 100-foot buffer around streams, ponds, wetlands, and requires a 300-foot riparian buffer around the high-quality, exceptional value streams that we so prize and treasure here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I could list many of the benefits, but you know, and you're going to hear from someone far more experienced and far more knowledgeable in the field than am I, Dr. Sweeney. But it's very essential that we balance our buffer requirements with the reality of citizens and their private property rights. And I feel that Senate Bill 560 has provided for the homeowner and various protections that seek this balance. We passed last year House Bill 1565 in the legislature. I voted against it. I know Greg voted against it. House Bill 1565 reduced the size of the buffers and went against protections that I think are necessary to protect our quality waterways here. We heard the argument that, well, we need that land. Our folks don't want to lose our property right at developing as close to the streams as they can. And I said, well, try to listen to us who didn't have it in effect many years ago and are now suffering the consequences of having that construction right up against the stream beds. So we'll continue to try to pursue the passage of Senate Bill 560 in the Senate of Pennsylvania and work with Greg in the House of Representatives. And I do want to acknowledge that Greg has talked to me on numerous occasions in the hallway, in the office, about riparian buffer legislation. In the bathroom, yeah. And we will continue to work together on that. The bathroom's right across from my office and Greg's office. So we continue to work on that together. I think it's a vitally important piece of legislation for Harrisburg. Certainly this time of the year, there are a few other things taking the spotlight. One is called a budget, and the number 2 item is called a budget, and the number 3 item is called a budget. We're also looking at pensions and property tax and some of the other issues. But this is one that will always remain at the forefront for me and for Greg. With us today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Bern Sweeney, President and Senior Research Scientist at Stroud Water Research Center. Dr. Sweeney is the foremost expert in the benefits of riparian buffers, and his research has provided the proof of the effectiveness of buffers. His years of research have provided valuable data on the health of our waterways, and the conclusion is favorable if we protect our riparian buffers and protect our waterways. EPA, as of 2013, reported that 55% of the river and stream length in the U.S. is in poor condition. Of that 55%, streamside disturbance and the lack of riparian buffer vegetation were the reason for this poor prognosis in 25% of the cases. Our streams are in need of protection. They supply water to our many homes and businesses. They are great recreation center here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have people come in from other states to fish here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to boat here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it's vitally, and to watch the wildlife here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That riparian buffer system plays an integral part. I was recently at a meeting where they were going to disturb the East Brandywine with a gas line. Senator Dinniman and I spoke out against the disturbance. I have to say that the gas company didn't win, but they did a fantastic job in really taking care of the waterway and how they were cleaning up the water. But we also use it like Victory Beer, Victory Brewing in Downtown, Pennsylvania. They use the East Brandywine, that section of the East Brandywine, because those guys learned to be brewmasters in Germany. And that section of the East Brandywine, the minerals in that waterway are the closest resemblance of what they find in the waterways of Germany, which is remarkable when you think of that. So it's our obligation for ourselves, our children, the next generations, to be good stewards of our waterways here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I'm passionate about that. I know Greg is, and we'll continue to work together to highlight riparian buffers here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I have to run to another meeting, but Shaw Mall from my office, who's worked with me on the riparian buffer legislation, will stay here. And now, with great pleasure, I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Sweeney. Doctor?
Thank you, Senator Rafferty. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the science of riparian buffers. Next slide. Next slide. So, as the Senator was just talking about, it's really important that we protect our streams and rivers. And I remind you that 43 years ago, we passed the Clean Water Act, whose purpose was to both restore and maintain the integrity of our nation's streams. Next slide. However, this is a report card that just came out last year from the US EPA. These are all the streams and rivers that the US EPA assessed to get a pulse on where we are at with regard to water quality in the United States. Next slide. And unfortunately, the report card last year was not good. The overall assessment across all those streams and rivers that I just showed you is right here. Basically, 55% of the streams and rivers in the United States are in what we call poor condition, that red condition. In the East, it's even worse. This is the report card for the East. 63% of the streams in the East are in poor condition. Next slide. What does it mean to be in poor condition? If you're a red stream or in a poor condition stream, it means that about 70% of the species, the plants and animals that ought to be living in that stream can no longer exist in that stream because the water is of insufficient quality. That's a big red flag. I don't know about you, but if 70% of the people in my neighborhood moved out overnight, I would say, what's wrong with my neighborhood? And so this is a big red flag that we're not quite there yet with regard to protecting the water quality of our streams and rivers. Next slide. So how are we doing with respect to the water quality? Next slide. I'd say we're coming up short, and we can't afford to come up short, especially with water quality, because water is the lifeblood of humans. It's behind everything that we do. Every animal, every plant that lives in our watersheds needs to have access to clean, fresh water, or they don't exist, right? Next slide. So the issue really is us. Next slide. And a lot of us. So there will be 8.5 billion of us on this planet by the year 2025. We have several 100 million people in the United States alone. And the issue is that each of these individuals in the United States, in the world, need access to clean, fresh water and need access to our watersheds for doing their business. Next slide. I want to remind you that it's only been 400 years since all the streams and the rivers in Pennsylvania were in such condition that you could drink water out of them and not feel like you were going to get sick, right? Only 400 years ago. Today, you can't drink water out of any of them directly without seriously jeopardizing getting sick. Next slide. The reason that they're in the present condition is that the hundreds of millions of people that have moved into the United States or have been born in the United States want to have access to those watersheds for several different things, but certainly 3 key things in their life. One is housing. Everybody wants a piece of the watershed for their house. We all have houses. Secondly, next slide, is their business. Everybody wants a little piece of the watershed for their business. Whether they're an attorney in a high-rise building here in Harrisburg, or they're running a sawmill out in some Amish farm in Lancaster, that's a little piece of the watershed that used to be an old-growth forest, now has to be dedicated to something else. Next slide. And of course, growing food. We all need to have food. And so those are a lot of pieces of watershed, right? 8.5 billion people, a piece of the watershed for housing, for business and food. That's a lot of pieces of watershed. Next slide. When you trade forest in a watershed for something other than that, like business, house, food production, water quality takes a hit. There's no question about it. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Every time we lose a piece of the watershed to some of these other things, water quality declines. Next slide. So the problem is we can't go back. We can't go back to a pristine old-growth forest in Pennsylvania. We need to go forward. So the burning issue, next slide, is whether we actually can have all these pieces of the watershed dedicated to housing, businesses, and food, and still have clean, fresh water for both humans and for wildlife. Next slide. My answer is yes. We have the ability to do this. We have the technology. We know how to do this. We know how to occupy the land, but still not have the water quality deteriorate. Next slide. So the simplest thing that we can do to use the land without destroying the water is to just, as I say here, create a little bit of space between the danger of what we're doing and what we're trying to protect. right? So, next slide. This is an analogy I use when I do these workshops in Lancaster County for the Amish, and it really resonates with them, right? And I'm hoping it resonates with you. This is my power saw. Those are my fingers. And I say here, operating a power saw is very dangerous, right? How is it possible for Bern Sweeney as a scientist, not a carpenter, a scientist, a geeky scientist, to pull that off the shelf on a Saturday morning and cut boards for 4 hours straight and not cut my fingers off? Because I haven't. There they are, right? I have all my fingers, right? Next slide. The danger of what we're doing is cutting boards. The dangerous part of this instrument is right here, this blade. This blade can take my finger off in a split second. What we're trying to protect is my hand, right? What we do is we create it's designed into the instrument, the device, right? We create a little bit of space between the blade and my hand. Now in this case, it's only 3 or 4 inches, but obviously it's sufficient because I have all my fingers, right? And then we put something in that space that actually makes the space more effective. And in this case, it's this shield. So we put a steel shield in that space so it makes the space more effective. Next slide. The same thing holds for the environment, right? So what's the danger of what we're doing here? The danger of what we're doing here is growing this corn. So you might say to yourself, listen, my father was a farmer. I know growing corn is not dangerous. Growing corn is dangerous. It involves a lot of dangerous stuff. In order to get the corn that tall and without weeds, we need to put chemicals on that corn, right? We need to put things like atrazine on the corn. And if I were to mix up a gallon of atrazine and sit on the table here and ask anyone in this room to walk up and drink it and say, I would give you $500 on the spot, nobody would walk up and drink it because everybody knows that drinking a gallon of atrazine is going to kill you because it's toxic, right? This small stream right here is what we're trying to protect. This small stream, if you follow it 12 miles downstream, is the water intake for the city of Newark, Delaware. It's a public drinking water supply. So we don't want those people drinking atrazine any more than we want, you would want to drink it in this room, right? So we just need to create a little bit more space. This space, next slide, this space right here is inadequate for keeping what we put on this corn out of that water body. The science tells us dramatically it's inadequate, right? So we just need to move the corn back a little bit and make that space more effective. We need to put something in it. We're not going to put a steel shield in there like we do the power saw, but what we need to put in that space are trees. And I'm going to tell you in a few minutes that trees in that space really does a great job of making that space more effective. Next slide. So what we need to do is we just need a buffer. We need a space between what we want to do on the landscape. In this case, it's a farm. It could be a housing development. It could be something else. And what we're trying to protect, we're trying to protect this, right? So a little bit of space, we call that a buffer, and we need to put trees in it. Pretty simple. Next slide. So that's what's been done in that particular example. There's that lonely tree that was there. The corn used to be right here. Now in this, for example, the corn has been moved back 100 feet. We're still growing it, but now we have a space and we're filling it with trees. These are young trees that have been planted, and that space is going to be very effective to keeping that atrazine from getting into the water. Next slide. So let's define a streamside forest buffer, right? What is a streamside forest buffer? Next slide. It's a best management practice for keeping stuff out of streams. And stuff is this great word that we have in our lexicon that basically describes, toxic chemicals, sediments, things that we don't want to have in the stream from getting in the stream. So a buffer is keeping that stuff out of the stream, right? Next slide. Wrong. It's more than that. I say it's wrong because it's more than that. Next slide. A streamside buffer does two things. One, it keeps the stuff out of the stream, but secondly, and maybe even more importantly, it enhances the quality of the stream, the health of the stream, so it puts that stream in a strong position to actually process anything that gets into it. And I'm going to argue with you in a few minutes that we can't keep it all out. It is going to get in there, and so we actually need the stream to be our second line of defense. Next slide. So I want to share with you the results of just 2 case studies, both of which were done in Pennsylvania, about the ability of a streamside forest buffer to, 1, keep things from getting into a stream, and 2, making the stream healthy so that it actually can process things that get into it. So case study 1 was done in southeastern Pennsylvania. I was the senior research scientist on the project, and it took us 20 years to do this project. We started this in 1990, and in 2010, we published a paper on it. So it took us 20 years to do the project. What we did was we took a farm field that was being farmed down to the edge of the stream. We pushed the corn back 100 feet, creating the space, and then we planted little seedlings in there that were 18 inches tall. And we followed the ability of that space to keep things out from growing corn, from getting into that stream over the next 20 years. Next slide. So the overall results of that paper, and it's publicly available to you, and I can give you the paper, was that space was able to keep 26% of the nitrogen that was being put on that corn from getting in that small stream, and over 43% of the sediment from getting into the stream. So those are big numbers. Maybe 26% doesn't seem like a big number to you, but if I can get you 26% on your money, you're going to invest with me, right? I mean, it's a big number. But, next slide. This is really a good news, bad news story. So the good news is that, yeah, we removed 26% of the nitrogen. But the bad news is that 74% of the nitrogen is still getting in the creek, right? So this is where the other side of the buffer comes into play. Next slide. So the conclusion from that study was that even if we put best management practices on all our farms and all our housing developments, we're never going to keep everything from getting in the stream. We're going to keep a high percentage, but we're not going to keep it all. So we need the stream itself to be a second line of defense. We need the stream itself to keep things from moving down into our bigger rivers, to our water intake for cities, and into our estuaries and the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. So next slide. So I want to share with you case study 2, which addresses this issue of the ability of the stream to actually, or the ability of the buffer to actually improve the health of the stream so that it can process stuff that gets into it. So this is a study we did also in Pennsylvania, and this is actually a diagram of the landscape of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, I remind you, Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods, because at one time Pennsylvania was 100% forested. Well, Pennsylvania is no longer 100% forested because we needed to remove forests for houses and for business and for food, right? So this is what the forest patches of Pennsylvania look like now. So consequently, our streams flow in and out of patches of forest. And we said, you know, we can learn an awful lot about whether or not trees can help along a stream by just going out to the real landscape and looking at how healthy a stream is when it has forest along it, like right here, and how healthy it is when it doesn't have forest, like right here. And by the way, these two reaches of stream are within 100 feet of one another. So the same chemistry in the water, the same amount of water, but basically no trees and the presence of trees. And this is what we found when we did that. Next slide. We found 5 key things. One was that, first of all, the banks of a forested stream are much more stable, have much greater integrity because of the roots from the trees, to keep them from sloughing in when the stream becomes bank full during a rainstorm, right? When you don't have trees growing on the banks, the streams are trying to be protected by grass, and grass is ineffective, and the banks fall into the stream, and it becomes a very unstable situation. Very difficult to get a healthy ecosystem going there. Secondly, small forested streams are significantly wider than their counterparts that don't have trees on them. So if I have a small stream that's this wide as this room, in a forest setting, when that stream flows out into a deforested area like a horse pasture or a cow pasture, that stream will narrow up to be about 4 or 5 feet wide, as opposed to the whole width of this room. And you say to yourself, what difference does that make? Well, it makes a huge amount of difference, because the ecosystem of the stream that we want to process pollutants for us is located on the bottom of the stream. So if the stream is as wide as this room, it has a lot of bottom area, a lot of ecosystem to work for us. If the stream is only 4 feet wide, it has a lot less per unit length of stream. So basically, it really makes a big difference to have a wide stream, and streams get really wide when you have forest along them, so we need it. Next slide. Third thing is that streams have more natural temperature. You are all familiar with the fact that your workers work more efficiently if you air condition their offices. If this Capitol building is 95 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of the summer, the people aren't working as efficiently. The same thing happens in a stream. If streams don't have the right temperature, the organisms that are in them don't work very well, right? Brook trout die when it gets too warm. Mayflies die, and so on and so forth. So we need to have the forest cover on a small stream to keep the stream from getting too warm and be in a position to work more effectively for us to processing these pollutants. The fourth thing is that streams, when they're shaded by a forest, produce the right kind of food, right? Number one, they produce the right kind of algae. When a stream is shaded, it produces a kind of algae that will really nicely support the kind of life that we need to have in the stream to do this work for us in processing pollution. When the stream is unshaded, it grows the wrong kind of algae, and basically the organisms that live in a stream are actually starving. They're very unhealthy. They're not in a very good physical condition. And the last thing I want to point out is that streams receive a lot of food subsidy from the forest that we have put on their banks. So all the leaves that fall in the stream in the fall are really good for the stream. They make the ecosystem healthy so that it can actually do this work for us. Next slide. So it's this ecosystem that we're trying to make healthy because that is what processes things. A stream ecosystem can process almost everything. A stream ecosystem can process PCBs if it's in a healthy state. If the stream is dead and it's unhealthy, it becomes just a pipe, and whatever goes into it just gets transported immediately downstream to our large rivers, to our water intakes for our towns, to our large embayments, to the oceans. And so we don't want our streams to be pipes. We want them to be healthy ecosystems so that they can actually keep stuff from moving down. Next slide. So the science is saying that we need a buffer of trees along each stream. The issue is how wide. How wide? You heard the senator talking about how wide these buffers need to be. Next slide. We just published a paper a few months ago in a very respected journal, peer-reviewed journal, and we reviewed 238 studies, myself and a colleague. I spent 2.5 years working on this one paper. I read 238 studies to try to figure out the answer to this question: how wide does this need to be? Next slide. We reviewed a whole list of criteria associated with buffer width. You know, how well does the width of a buffer affect the health of the fish, the ability to process nitrogen, the ability to keep sediment out of the stream, and all these different kinds of things that are important to the health and well-being of stream, as well as to the economy of Pennsylvania. Next slide. The overall concluding statement of that paper, that technical paper, was that we need 100 feet on both sides of the stream of forest to order to keep things out and to make the water clean and healthy, right? 100 feet is what we need. Next slide. So the science says 100 feet on either side of the stream. Next slide. I realize that that's a lot of land. That's a lot of land, 100 feet on either side of every stream in Pennsylvania. Next slide. But as I say here, 35 will not get the job done. We thought that 35 feet or 50 feet would get the job done, but when we did this literature review, the science is telling us it's not adequate. Next slide. I'm going to give you an example using sediment. Sediment is one of the #1 pollutants in the United States. It's one of the biggest issues for companies that provide drinking water to the public. You ask a drinking water utility company, what's your biggest issue? What's your biggest problem? It's dealing with the fact that their water, it's dealing with the fact they take chocolate-colored water into their intake during rainstorms. It's very difficult to get that material, to get the sediments out of the water, right? And so I want to point out, next slide. In that review, there's a graph that looks like this. And this graph is based on 20 different studies. Each one of these data points is a separate, large, individual scientific study unto itself. We've put all this together in our review to show what the big picture is. This is a graph that shows the ability of a buffer to keep sediment out of a stream and how wide the buffer of trees is, ranging from 0 to 200 feet wide, right? So you see the relationship. As the buffer gets wider, the ability to keep the sediment out of the stream increases. Next slide. What these data show us is that for the first 35 feet, we are able to remove 64% of the sediment, right? That's the good news. The bad news is that of that 64%, none of it is the silts and the clays. All of the 64% are large particles like sand grains, like larger particles of sediment. The particles that are causing problems for increasing the expense of cleaning our water for drinking purposes or causing problems for the ecology, like killing fish, killing aquatic invertebrates and things like that, are the silts and the clays. The silts and the clays are not being removed by the first 35 feet of the buffer. Next slide. The silts and the clays get removed at the 100-foot level. We need 65 more feet to get rid of the silts and the clays. So what this said to us was, if we're going to stick to this 35-foot or 50-foot scenario, 15 years from now, we're going to still have the same problems we have today. Our water providers are still going to have a big expense in cleaning the water, and our streams are going to be dead, right? So we need to go, next slide. So we need to go wider. So the science says we need 100 feet, and yes, that's a lot of land, but I want to leave you with two final thoughts about 100 feet, and 100 feet is a lot of land. First of all, the point here I'm making is that 100 feet, the 100 feet estimate that I've given you is based on the science. I haven't embellished it. It's quantitative, it's in the paper, it's basically what the science was telling us, right? I could have told you that we need to go to 200 feet because I want to be safe about it, right? This is what engineers have done in the past. When the engineers designed this Capitol building, they figured out what the strength of materials needed to be to make this building stand erect during a hurricane, during a snowstorm, and not collapse and kill hundreds of people like us today in this room, right? They took that calculation of how strong the steel and the wood and everything needed to be, and then you know what they did? They doubled it. That's standard engineering practice. You double it because you build in a safety factor. The 100 feet that I'm telling you, I don't have any safety factor built in there. That's exactly what the science is telling us. That doesn't include a safety factor. Next slide. So here, you know, this small stream is the water intake for a town in Newark, Delaware. And I'm saying we need at least 100 feet to protect that stream and those people from what we're putting on that cornfield. Next slide. So I ask you to just think about this. Why is it that for the greater public good, we are not allowed to cut corners when we design a building like this? We actually have to build in safety factors, and that's standard common practice. But when we talk about safeguarding the public in this arena, we always talk about, well, let's cut corners. I hear you, Bern, you saying the science has 100 feet, but can we get by with 35 feet? Can we get by with 50 feet? And I'm just telling you, that's not a compromise that we shouldn't go there. We thought 35 feet would do it, but we now know from the literature review we just did that it's not. We need 100 feet, and next slide. So we need 100 feet on both sides of the stream to protect humans and wildlife. That's what the science is saying, and that's really the message that I've come here to tell you. Thank you for listening. I'd be glad to answer any questions. I knew that analogy would work. It's crystal clear, right? Sean?
The 100 foot, does that factor in slope, the slope factor? How does slope affect?
Well, you know, the 238 studies we used for our literature review, they were all different slopes, from no slope to steep slopes. And so we're saying those data say on the average 100 feet. So, yeah, would it be a little bit on a certain slope or a little bit more? Yeah, it is, but this is on average. So this is, yeah.
Does 100 feet help you at all when it comes to flooding or flood damages or water quality?
Yeah, so the question is whether 100 feet helps you with flooding issues like the quantity of water. And the answer is yes, of course, because one of the side benefits of making small streams wider, right, and also having trees growing on the banks and having trees fall into the stream and putting large woody debris in, you know, having wider streams with large woody debris one of the big side effects, positive side effects, is that you slow down the floodwaters. The amount of time that it takes for the floodwaters to enter the stream and to move down to our bigger tributaries and our big rivers and cause flooding down there is greatly reduced. In fact, this is becoming best management practice. How do you mitigate the rate at which a large rainstorm actually causes flooding downstream? Make the streams wider by planting the right trees along them and put woody debris in them to slow down the floodwater. So yeah, so there's a great positive side benefit of flooding. Yes?
Do you have your 20-year study available here today in paper?
If you give me your card, I can have it to you in a couple hours. It's available as a PDF, but I don't remember if that's in the package. Yeah, but it's a 10-page paper, but I can send it to you as a PDF. If you give me your card, yep.
And we have on the sign-in sheet, we got an email list, so we can send a copy of the paper to everybody who signed in.
Yeah, and that study's going on. You know, we planted little seedlings. Now they're mature. Well, they're 23-year-old trees, but and what we've been seeing is that the ability to intercept things and to make things better has actually been increasing with time as that forest grows. So we decided to go to press in 2010 and those results are average for the previous 10 years, but things are still continuing to get better. So we're getting good results. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and I'd be glad to answer any questions after we close. Thank you. Oh, Representative,
We
please.
really appreciate all the great, not only educational work, but the advocacy work. I know, and Professor Sweeney really helping with the educational, helping us legislators try to figure out this stuff. I mean, you were very instrumental when the Hahn bill, was it 1565, worked. We were able to water that down, no pun intended. And I think got to the point where it actually was something that most people can live with. So thank you for the great advocacy work you do. You need to be ever vigilant on these issues. I know that the pecuniary interests who do make a profit from putting homes next to streams really have lobbyists and make political contributions and so forth. So it's a battle that never ends. And finally, just tip my hat to Senator Rafferty. So valuable to have a senator, a Republican senator, who not only really takes the time to understand the issues, but to be proactive in introducing and forwarding legislation. So thank you again for everybody who put this on, and keep up the good work. Thank you.